Productions. And here we go.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Shane, DAV's legislative team, Deputy Legislative Director here in DC. We're going to go ahead and get started here in a second. But before we do, just as a reminder, everybody's microphones will be on mute. And if you have questions throughout the presentation, we have the questions box that you can fill out. We have other members of the legislative team with us this afternoon, so they'll be able to help answer any of the questions. So give us just a second and we will get ready to go. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am Shane Lehrman, DAV's Deputy National Legislative Director. And this afternoon, we're going to have a little webinar and go over the basics of the legislative process. I know many of you may be new benefits protection team leaders, so a lot of the legislative process really controls what we do as an organization, as a legislative team, and it also impacts our resolution. So it's going to be an overview going through this process. So I'm glad you were all able to join us this afternoon. As a DAV leader, you can be an effective advocate for ill and injured veterans and their families when you familiarize yourself with how the public policy process works and the times in which our advocacy or your advocacy locally can have the greatest impact on what we do. So we're going to take a look at three things for the basics of the legislative process. We're going to look at Congress, how a bill becomes a law, and DAV resolutions. So we're going to look at all of these processes, and the first thing we need to talk about is Congress itself, because if we don't have a good understanding of Congress, it may be a little hard for us to understand the actual legislative process and the process of a bill. So we're going to jump right into this because the United States Constitution, our federal government, is separated into three branches. So per the U.S. Constitution, it's broken into three branches that provide checks and balances on each other. Those are the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. If you're thinking, wow, I wonder how those are separated out, good question. They are separated out by the legislation into Congress, which is the House and the Senate. The executive branch is the president, the vice president, and their appointees and the administration, the federal government itself. And then the third is the judicial branch, or the United States Supreme Court. You might be thinking to yourself, well, Shane, I hear so much different terminology that it can be confusing at times. So exactly what is Congress? That's a great question. Glad you were thinking it, because Congress is the legislative branch, and it's comprised of a bicameral system. And by a bicameral system, what we mean is that there are two chambers. So bills must pass both chambers to become a law. So a bill has to pass the Senate and the House of Representatives before it can go to the president. So Congress is made up of a bicameral system, two chambers. And there is an image of the House and the Senate up on the hill, separated on different sides. And first, we're going to talk about the Senate. The Senate is often referred to as the upper chamber of Congress. There are 100 members of the Senate, 2 for every state. So each state has 2 senators. Equal number is 100 members of the U.S. Senate. Now, each senator serves a 6-year term. And the Senate, for most people, seems like it can act a little bit slower, and that is because the Senate usually takes a little more time when they're considering legislation, because they're looking at the long-term effects of the law, more of the end game. Again, they have a 6-year term. They're looking at the end game of legislation more so than just a a quick piece of legislation passed into law. Now, as we noted, the U.S. Senate has 100 members, and 1/3 of those members of the Senate are elected every 2 years. So they have a 6-year term. They're elected every 2 years. So every 2 years, only 33 or at one point 34 senators are up for election at any one time, which means the Senate is not going to have a huge rollover after every election because they have it staged out that to where only 1/3 of the Senate changes every 2 years. Now, the United States Senate is comprised of committees. Committees are important. We're going to talk about them here in a little bit. And each committee in the Senate has a chair and a ranking member. So there are approximately 16 committees. That's where a bill or a piece of legislation is assigned to. And the two committees that we work with the most as part of DAV's legislative team are the Veterans Affairs Committee, or SVAC, Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. And one of the other committees we do have some interaction with, not as much, is the Armed Services, or the Senate Armed Services Committee, SASC. So those are the two committees we deal with the most. Mostly in the Senate, we deal with the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. So now that we have a little bit of an overview of the U.S. Senate, we need to know the differences and how they interact with the U.S. House of Representatives. And again, we have a bicameral system. That means we have the Senate and the House, two separate bodies. So the House is often referred to as the lower chamber, and there are 435 members of the House, and they serve a 2-year term. So as you notice, a little bit different than the Senate. Senator serves for 6 years. A member of the House of Representatives, or what we often say a congressman, serves a 2-year term. And one of the big differences for the House and the Senate is in the House, laws that are dealing with revenue must always start in the House of Representatives versus the Senate. And that's actually written right into the Constitution, that laws dealing with revenue must start in the House of Representatives. Now, as we talked about the U.S. Senate, not all of them are up for a re-election. They have 6-year terms. It's every 2 years, and it's about 1/3 of them. The House is different. All 435 seats in the House are up for re-election every 2 years. That's right. If you're a member of the House of Representatives, you only have a 2-year term. The next election for all U.S. representatives is November 2022. So in a little bit over a year, all of the members of the House will have to run again for election in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, we did discuss committees a little bit in the U.S. Senate. And in the House of Representatives, they have 21 committees. So they have 5 more committees than the U.S. Senate. And again, just like the committees over there, each committee has a chairman and a ranking member. The chair is generally going to be a member of the majority party, and the ranking member will be the leader of that committee for the minority party, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. Whoever has the majority in the House or the Senate, they'll appoint the chair, the majority will, and the ranking member will be appointed by the minority. So that's how a committee is kind of structured and assigned. And in the House of Representatives, we did note there are 21 committees. Well, there is a Veterans Affairs Committee in the House, often referred to as the House Veterans Affairs Committee, or HVAC. And HVAC is broken down into subcommittees. So in the Senate, there's just the one committee. In the House, there's what we refer to as the full committee of HVAC. And then there are subcommittees. The subcommittees are Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, or DAMA. That's generally where you're going to see hearings and pieces of legislation considered that have to do with compensation and pension issues, survivors' benefits, burial benefits. Those are all going to be found in there. Economic Opportunity, or the EO Committee, that's where you're going to find pieces of legislation revolving education and employment issues, as well as transition assistance services from the military. The Health Subcommittee, pretty obvious, they're going to be dealing with VA healthcare issues. The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, O&I, They're going to be looking at larger issues or investigating specific issues within VA, and they are referred to as the ONI. The last subcommittee in the House of Representatives is the Technology Modernization Subcommittee, or TechMod. They created the subcommittee just a few years ago, and they consider things like the electronic healthcare record system, the EHR, that is currently trying to be implemented throughout the country. The oversight arm of that would be the Subcommittee on Technology and Modernization within the full House Veterans Affairs Committee, or HVAC. So you might be thinking to yourself, Shane, what does the 117th Congress mean? I hear these things all the time. The 115th Congress, 117th Congress. Isn't Congress Congress? Well, it is and it isn't. So that's a really good question. Glad you had that with us this afternoon, because the U.S. Congress operates in 2-year terms called Congress. I know, good and confusing. But again, the U.S. the U.S. Congress operates in 2-year terms called a Congress. Each Congress is divided into 2 sessions, and currently we are in the first session of the 117th Congress. The 117th Congress started in January of 2021, earlier this year, and it will end in December 2022. So as you may remember, just a few minutes ago, we talked about the House of Representatives and how all 435 members are up for re-election every 2 years. Well, a new Congress, which operates in 2-year term, starts after those elections in the House every 2 years. So the elections are in November of 2022. That means the 118th Congress will start in January of 2023. So that's how they break it out. When you hear us talking about different Congresses, that's exactly how it works. And the important thing to remember, any bills that are introduced during this first session of the 117th Congress have until December 2022 to be acted upon. So any new bills introduced right now have approximately 14 months to be considered before the end of December 2022. This is very important to remember, because if a bill's been introduced but not passed by December 2022, that bill will be considered to be dead. It has died. It's no longer applicable. So that means when the 118th Congress starts in January of 2023, that's a new Congress. The bills that didn't get passed during the 117th Congress would then have to be reintroduced into the new Congress to be considered again. So these are a lot of important things to remember when you're looking at the legislative process. We have the Senate, we have the House. Bills have to pass both of those. We have a term of Congress itself, which is a 2-year cycle. And currently we are on the first term of the 117th. And remember, everything introduced during this period has until December 2022 to be passed into law. So that brings us to the next part of this. Now that we've addressed Congress a little bit and some differences between the Senate and the House, we now need to take a look at, well, how does a bill become a law? Everybody remembers that song, I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill. Yeah, from Saturday mornings. Started on ABC Schoolhouse Rock. And we're going to kind of run through, how does a bill become a law? But before we jump into that entire discussion, there's 7 basic steps. But before we jump into it, I want to put all of this into just a little bit of perspective for everyone. So in the 116th Congress, 2019 to 2020, over 16,000 bills were introduced. That's right, 16,000 bills were introduced during the 116th Congress. 344 of those bills became law. Think about that. Only 2% of the bills introduced actually became law. So we need to really understand that and have some level of expectations when we're dealing with our members of Congress. Not all of the bills that are going to be introduced are actually going to become law, a very small part of it. That's why it's very important that we understand the steps, are active during these 7 steps we're going to talk about, and how we can get you and your chapters and departments to be engaged through these processes with DAV's resolutions to make sure that those veterans bills that are important to us are a part of that 2 or 3% of bills that are actually passed into law. So let's go ahead and jump into the first step. And the first step of how a bill becomes a law, or a bill to a law, is members of the House or Senate draft, sponsor, and introduce bills for consideration by Congress. This is the important thing to remember. Only members of Congress can introduce bills. Only members of Congress can introduce bills. Your chapter and your department cannot introduce a bill. DAV here in Washington, D.C., up on the Hill, when we go up there, we can't introduce a bill. It has to be a member of Congress who actually introduces that piece of legislation. Now, after it is introduced, the bill is then usually assigned to a committee. And as we talked about just a few minutes ago, it would generally be assigned to the Veterans Affairs Committee if it's an issue that we're following and engaged with. Now, DAV is involved in every step of this process. For example, there is the Veterans Burn Pit Exposure Recognition Act that was introduced in the Senate last year and again this year. And it was based on an idea unique to DAV that we pitched to Senator Sullivan and Senator Manchin. And they introduced our idea into the Senate. They drafted up the language, got it reviewed, got it introduced as a bill. So DAV is very engaged in every step of the process to include this first step by helping with the creation of a bill and being engaged in trying to get our ideas and our resolutions introduced into Congress. So now that the bill has been introduced and it's been assigned to a committee, step 2 is what we refer to as committee action. Often a committee or subcommittee, as we noted, may request reports from government agencies, hold hearings, so experts and interested parties have an opportunity to offer testimony regarding the issue or revise the bill. So DAV is involved in this step 2 committee action all the time, as we often provide testimony at hearings as recognized experts on certain topics, such as toxic exposures, women veterans, education and employment, healthcare, and mental health issues, treatment, and suicide prevention. So DAV as an organization is very much engaged in step 2 by providing this information to the committees, being experts, talking to them before the hearings and after the hearings, and making sure that we get these issues addressed correctly. Or a lot of times, if you've seen DAV testimony, we'll even make recommendations to revise the bill to make it better for veterans and for the purpose involved. So now the full committee, continuing on with step 2 in committee action, the full committee may make a recommendation to pass the bill, to revise it, what we refer to as markup or a markup hearing, and release the bill known as reporting out. So let's say the Veterans Affairs Committee, in this case, take a look at the Veterans Burn Pit Recognition Exposure Act. And in the last Congress, the committee, they held a hearing, we testified on it, and they passed it out of committee or reported the bill out of the committee. Why is that important? Well, if a bill is under the jurisdiction of that committee and that committee chairman, they hold a hearing, and now they talk about it at a markup hearing to vote and adopt it to get it out of committee. That means they approved it out of committee. That's really important, because if they don't do that, we can't move on to step 3, which is floor action. This is when the bill is returned to the full House or the Senate for further debate and approval. And at this point, other members may propose amendments to that bill, add additional text, or otherwise alter the bill. So once it's available for floor action, this is when they have the floor debate. If you've ever watched any of the floor debate online or on C-SPAN, you can see them debating on very specific issues to try to either make amendments or make changes to the bill. Once they're done with the floor action, then it'll come time for the majority leadership to determine the next step, and that is whether to bring it to the floor for a full vote. So the fourth step of how a bill becomes a law, after it's been introduced, after we've had committee action, it's reported out of the committee, after it's gone to the floor and had its debate, step 4 is the vote. So House and Senate members vote on their respective versions of the proposed bill or the piece of legislation. So this is when they vote on these, and in many cases, DAV, as I noted, we're engaged throughout this entire process. We may have some insight as to the outcome of the floor votes because we were also engaged in step 3 with the floor debate and the floor action behind the scenes, working with the committee staffers. And a lot of times we'll also have some insight from all of the conversations and contacts we have within the committees on how a floor vote may go and what we're expecting and what we're going to be looking at. So after step 4 and it's been voted on, step 5, if required, is what's called a conference committee. So a bill, as we noted, must be approved by both chambers of the Congress. It must pass the House and it must pass the Senate. Once a bill passes the House, it'll be referred to the Senate. If it's a veterans bill, it'll go to the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. They'll acknowledge it was passed by the House, and then they'll have to take action and consider what to do next as part of the committee action step. Vice versa. If it's a bill that passes the Senate first, then it'll go to the House. If it's a veterans bill, it'll go to the House Veterans Affairs Committee, or HVAC, and they'll determine what to do with the bill next in committee action before they can bring it to the floor. So that's if a bill has passed cleanly through. Well, you might be thinking, well, Shane, what happens if there's differences? Well, I'm glad you asked, because under step 5, conference committees, when either chamber approves a bill that was passed by the other chamber, they must resolve any differences and different versions of the bill. And this does happen frequently. For example, right now there is the Cost of War Act pending in the Senate. It went through the introduction process, it went through the committee action process, and it was approved out, and now it's waiting for floor action. That piece of legislation, the Cost of War Act, is all on toxic exposures. It's a huge omnibus bill. Now, it is different than the toxic exposure omnibus bill that's pending in the House, which is called the Honoring Our Pact Act. There's differences between the two. So let's say if either one of those pass, they'll have to go through these processes to make sure that they can hammer out any differences in the conference committees of the bills and make any changes to make them consistent to go through and are approved by both the House and the Senate. So once a bill is approved by the House and by the Senate, any conference committees, any issues are hammered out. Now it's ready for the next step. What's step 6? That's right. You guessed it. If it passes the House and the Senate, it goes for presidential action. After the bill is passed by both chambers, it is sent to the president for approval or signature, which, if granted, creates a public law. So if it's gone through our first 5 steps and was approved by both the House and the Senate, and the president agrees and signs it, it becomes law. Well, what happens if the president doesn't want that piece of legislation to pass? Well, when a president comments on and refuses to sign a bill, it is known as a veto. A vetoed bill may return to Congress for reconsideration and requires a 2/3 majority to override a veto. There's a very good example of that just recently. last fall, the National Defense Authorization Act for 2021 passed the House and the Senate. They worked out all the differences in their committee conferences in step 5. And then step 6 was for it to go to the president. Well, the former president vetoed the National Defense Authorization Act last year. However, it went back to the House and the Senate, and they received a 2/3 majority to override the former president's veto, and it became law. So the president can, 1, sign it, or 2, veto the bill, and if the Congress doesn't have enough votes to override the veto, his veto will stand. If they override the veto, then it can become law, like the recent National Defense Authorization Act for 2021. So once we've got through these steps, the president signs it into law or they override the veto. Step 7 is the publication of the law. The Office of the Federal Register assigns the public law a number. In other words, PL, it'll be 117 for this year because it's the 117th Congress for this year and next. And then the government printing office prints it, formalizing the law. So once a bill goes through all these steps, the last step is the publication of it, making it official, formalizing that law. That's right. Yippee. We're all excited. And sometimes it's taken a very long time to get to that point, but we have. But we've gotten to that point many times. And a lot of times, too, as a part of step 6, DAV's actually been invited for an official signing of major veterans pieces of legislation. And we've actually been a part of every step of the process. Now, as a chapter or department, you can also be engaged in a lot of these steps, and especially step 7, once it becomes law, you can also get it published out there too. Once you know it's out there, you can put it in on your websites, any newsletters you may have, and in your social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, those kinds of things, and help us push out these new laws that are passed that are designed to help and improve veterans' benefits. So now, since we've talked about what Congress is and have walked through the 7 steps of how a bill becomes a law, the next portion we're going to cover is DAV resolutions. And why is it important, and what can you do with DAV resolutions as a part of the legislative process? Well, in previous webinars, we have discussed the importance of DAV resolutions and how they create our legislative agenda for each year. So DAV's Constitution and bylaws requires a legislative agenda every year from the National Convention. The National Convention has a legislative authority for the next year, which is why resolutions have to be introduced by chapters and departments and adopted and approved by the National Convention in order for us to use that as a part of our legislative agenda for the next years, because it's a requirement of the Constitution and bylaws. So once we have our legislative agenda, our resolutions, let's discuss 2 ways that they can impact the legislative process in Congress, and we get to see this all the time. So, for example, the first we're going to talk about is that members of Congress actually use DAV resolutions for bill introduction and or for drafting a piece of legislation. In the 116th Congress in 2019, Congresswoman Julia Brown out of California introduced a bill, H.R. 444, the Reduce Unemployment for Veterans of All Ages Act. Now, her bill was almost an exact copy of DAV Resolution number 102 at the time, to eliminate the 12-year period of eligibility for vocational rehabilitation. So think about that. Our resolution was almost a mirror image of her piece of legislation. And it even gets more exciting, trust me, it does, And it's because at a hearing in May of 2019, she actually quoted directly from DAV's resolution in her testimony about why this bill was so important. We were sitting in the hearing room, we were watching, we were engaged, and we actually saw her and heard her quoting our resolution. DAV Resolution 102 says, boom, that's the impact of DAV's legislative agenda, which is based on our resolutions that come from your chapters in your departments. So the second thing that these are used in the legislative process is DAV uses these resolutions to support and advocate for bills that are introduced. Many of you are already familiar with the DAV Commanders Action Network, or the DAV CAN, and we send out alerts to our network urging all of you and all of them to contact their members of Congress on specific bills. Actually, we just sent one out yesterday asking for you to reach out to your member of Congress in support. Now, all of these alerts that are sent out through the DAV Commanders Action Network are based on very specific pieces of legislation that we can support because of and based on our resolutions. That's why it's so important that we get resolutions from chapters and department through the National Convention, because that creates the things we can support and advocate for you on Capitol Hill. So you might be thinking, wow, Shane, this is some great information. I'm so glad, but we really want to help. So you might be thinking, how can you and your chapter and department help? I'm glad you're all engaged. You're all in. You want to know. Well, I'm going to tell you. You can help by setting up meetings with your members in your local areas to discuss our resolution book. So our new resolution book will be out very shortly. It's not quite out yet. So when it comes out, you can set up meetings, your chapter and department, with the senators and members of the House of Representatives in your local areas, and you can discuss issues in the resolution book. Take the book with you, give them a copy, pick out a few resolutions to discuss with them, and ask them to introduce that issue into a bill, right? Like we talked about the 7 steps of how a bill becomes a law. It's that first step. It has to be introduced. So guess what? You can have an impact. You can make a difference with our resolutions by talking to your member of Congress and getting them to introduce a DAV resolution as a bill and a piece of legislation. Or what you can also do is, after the release of an alert through the DAV Commanders Action Network, just like the one you got yesterday, you can schedule a meeting with your member's local office, take that alert with you, or the resolution book with you as well. Take all that information, set up a meeting virtually on the phone or in person if possible, and you can use that meeting as a follow-up to the emails sent through DAV's Commanders Action Network, DAV CAN, and request they co-sponsor the bill and that they be supportive of it. So this is what you can do in your own communities, in your chapters and departments. You can use the DAV resolution book and the Commanders Action Network alerts to set up meetings with your members of Congress, and you can have an impact directly on what's introduced and what's supported based on our resolutions. So the most recent legislative program, 2021-2022, as I noted, will be available very, very soon. We don't have it posted yet. We're shooting for the beginning of November, and there at the bottom is the link where you will be able to find the existing program of 2019 through 2020. And once a new legislative program has been officially reviewed, approved, updated, and published, you will find it on that location, that link there at the bottom of the screen. And you can go and make a difference in your communities with your elected officials by helping us use DAV's resolutions in the legislative process, and you too can make a difference. So now that we've talked about our 3 items we wanted to cover today, now it's time for a little bit of a summary of what we talked about during the basics of the legislative process. So as you remember, we talked about Congress, how Congress is the 3rd branch of the United States government, and Congress is separated by two chambers, the bicameral system, the Senate and the House of Representatives. We also talked about the difference between senators who serve 6-year terms, and a third of them are up for election every 2 years. And then we talked about the House of Representatives, which they have 435 members, which is based on population of the districts in the states. Those come up for re-election every 2 years. We also discussed that before a bill can become a law, it must pass through both chambers. That means it has to pass the Senate and the House. We talked about a term of Congress is 2 years, based on the same cycle of the elections of the House of Representatives. And the current Congress that we are in is the 117th Congress. We're in the first term, and it ends in December of 2022. We also then went over a little bit of the 7 steps of how a bill becomes a law. Step 1, the creation of a bill. Step 2, committee action, where DAV is often involved and engaged in hearings and testifying and providing additional resources and information to committee staff. Step 3 is floor action. After it's passed out of the committee, it can now go to the floor for debate and or changes and amendments. Step 4 is they have a vote on that specific piece of legislation in the Senate and or in the House. Step 5, if they pass both chambers and the bills are a little different, they have to go through the conference committees to hammer out any differences, go back and make sure both the House and the Senate still approves. If the bill passes the House and the Senate, then step 6 is our presidential action, where the president can sign it into law or where the president can veto it. In order for Congress to override a presidential veto, they need a 2/3 majority vote to override the veto, as we just saw last year for the National Defense Authorization Act, which actually happened. Step 7 is the publication of the law, and this is where it becomes a formal piece of law, given a public law number, and it's a formalization of that process, concluding our 7 steps of how a bill becomes a law. Then we went over DAV resolutions, how resolutions are used to introduce a bill. We've seen that. How resolutions are used to support bills. You see that in our DAV Commanders Action Networks all the time. And we also talked about how you can help, how you can get involved with your chapter, your department, how you can take that new resolution book when it comes out, set up meetings, talk about resolutions you want them to introduce into law, and 2, take that Commanders Action Network email you just got, set up a meeting, talk to them about it face-to-face, person-to-person, if possible. If not, set up a virtual meeting if that's available, or make some phone calls and let them know that you're a constituent, you want them to consider this piece of legislation. So there we have it, the basics of the legislative process. And I want to thank everybody for your time and for your attention this afternoon as we talked about that part of the process. And now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and stop the video at this point, and we will turn off the PowerPoint. I'm going to come back onto the screen, and any of the rest of the DAV legislative team that's with us will as well. We'll answer any questions that you have submitted throughout the presentation. So if you were thinking of something, it's a good time now to go ahead and enter that question into the question box.